Welcome to Big Blue Kickoff Live right here on Giants.com, joined by Lance Meadow. I am John Schmelk, talking Giants and NFL football with you for the next 60 minutes, getting ready for the 2017 NFL Draft. A very busy show coming your way today. We'll be joined by Mark Snyder from the Detroit Free Press in about 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll go through Michigan prospects. The last time we talked to Mark was actually, believe it or not, back in 2015 when Taylor Lewan came out in the draft. So it's been kind of quiet for Michigan prospects the last couple of years. Not a whole lot going on, but laundry list this year.
God.
So we'll have a lot to talk about with Mark, Mr. Meadow. And after we have Mark, we'll, of course, take your calls at 201-939-4513 and monitor your tweets at #GiantsChat. Lance, how's everything?
Everything's good. How's things with you? How's the arm?
Hands getting better. 2 weeks in. I got 4 weeks to go. Got the stitches out today.
Well, that's a positive development.
Which is a nice step in the right direction. Good therapy twice a week. We're moving along. But it appears that I would have a better chance playing football this year at this point than Tony Romo.
Yeah,
because
so look at that transition. Boy,
it was weak.
You were digging deep
I
for
did.
that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But he announced, he did not announce it, but Adam Schefter reporting that Tony Romo is going to retire after the Cowboys release him today. The Cowboys have not announced anything yet. And then he will go work for CBS. Early indications are, and I frankly find this hard to believe, that he's going to be immediately put into their first broadcast team with Jim Nantz, and I don't know what that means for Phil Simms, which is surprising to me because usually you try to work these guys in slowly, like Fox did with John Lynch. They kind of moved him slowly up the depth chart there.
Or put him in the studio before they get comfortable.
Something like that, but that's the word, so it looks like Tony Romo is going to retire. You wonder if he's going to have a clause in that TV contract where if Dak Prescott tears up an ankle in Week 6 and the Cowboys come calling, if he's going to come back and play, that wouldn't shock me. But it looks like this whole saga, thank goodness, I was tired of hearing about it, is coming to an end.
Yeah, well, ProFootballTalk.com is actually reporting that he probably is going to have a clause in the contract to enable him.
Okay.
That's what Mike Florio is reporting, and I would think that this may change the Cowboys' game plan to keep him and have him on the reserve retired list like Marshawn Lynch with Seattle, so that this way you still have his rights if he does determine that he wants to come back.
That's a good question. But if they do that, then they will not be able to save his salary cap space for this year and save that money, which they would get if they would release him. So,
it does have
if he's
some
on a
finances.
retired list, I don't know how that would work.
I don't know if that's 100% about whether or not they wouldn't have some flexibility.
I don't know how that would work,
to
be honest with you.
Around.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to check on that.
But with that being said, remember, they've been operating all this time since free agency started with him on the books to begin with.
Correct.
So, clearly, I think that the way that Dak Prescott's contract is structured, since he's still on a rookie deal, afforded them the luxury to hold on to Romo. That's why I'd be surprised if this changes the dynamics of their relationship with Romo, given the fact that, at least right now, it appears he's going to be retired.
Yeah, I got to imagine if he retires, they would owe him his bonus guaranteed money, which is what's still, the quote-unquote dead money on his contract.
Which had been spread out based on the restructuring.
Right, but I imagine the
forth.
base salary would disappear the same way he would if he was released and let go. I would think.
I think that's perhaps how it works. I don't know off the top of my head.
It's a good question.
I mean, it would make sense that it goes elsewhere to enable you to have some flexibility, considering a player is inactive and retired at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So what does this mean for the NFC East? Quite frankly, not a whole lot. I don't think a lot of people figured that Romo would be a big factor this year in the division anyway, given Dak Prescott's won the job and played extremely well last year. So it's just something we don't have to hear about on NFL This Morning. We don't have to hear about it on
well, you're still going to be hearing
about
about it for the next few days. I guarantee you that.
Well, yeah, only for a couple days, though,
Yeah.
and then we'll, of course, see Romo on CBS next year. How do you think he'll do? He's very well spoken.
He is.
He generally doesn't have when he does interviews, you don't get a sense of ton of energy from him and stuff like that. How do you think he'll do?
Well, I think in terms of the knowledge of the game, he's up there. So, I mean, if they want him to break it down and be an X's and O's type of guy, I think he fits that bill. In terms of personality and energy, I'll give you that maybe that remains to be seen. But, keep in mind, just from perusing some of the stories, he's had a big presence on social media during his off days here where he hasn't been active on the football field, and he's actually posted some funny videos. So I think this would actually give him the opportunity to show a different side of his personality that we haven't yet seen when you're an NFL player. Remember, when you don't want to bring attention to yourself and you're the quarterback of the Cowboys, sometimes you have that personality where you don't want to be the story. Correct. I mean, to a certain degree, Eli Manning is like that too. I think he plays to the New York media perfectly. He doesn't give them plenty of substance to run with because he knows how to play the game. But if you take Eli Manning off of the football field, you see he does have that comic side as well.
Absolutely. All right, thanks for joining us on Twitter, everybody. If you want to watch the rest of the show, go to Giants.com with the Giants mobile app. And in just a few moments, we'll be joined by Mark Snyder from the Detroit Free Press. So make sure you check that out. And now we do welcome in our guest. He's Mark Snyder from the Detroit Free Press. He joins us on Giants.com to talk about some of the prospects coming out of Michigan. Mark, you got John Schmelk and Lance Meadow here in East Rutherford, New Jersey. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
We're doing great, and it's been a couple years since we spoke back when Taylor Lewan was coming out of the draft. It's been a quiet few years for a couple years for Michigan prospects, but boy, do we have a laundry list for you today. So if we keep you too long, Mark, I want you to tell us, and we'll say goodbye, because this might go a little bit longer than you expect given all these players coming out of Michigan this year. So I will pre-warn you. Let's start with the guy that I suppose is the most polarizing player in the draft in a lot of ways, and that's Jabril Peppers. No one doubts his athleticism. People do doubt where he fits in on an NFL football field. What's your take in terms of where you think he will be most effective as a pro?
Jabril says he's a safety, and I think he's right. I think that's just the nature of his talents and kind of what he can do. I know a lot of people have questioned the coverage skills, and that's something that's fair. I think that's a fair criticism, and I don't think some of that's because he just wasn't in coverage that often. You didn't see him in coverage. You didn't see him. I mean, he has elite speed. In high school he was, which is just 4 years ago, he was running, 10 500s, and he was a state champion in track, so he can run with guys. But, obviously when you're in coverage, that's a situation where you need experience. You need to practice doing that every day. You need to know the techniques, and he was just doing a lot of it on athleticism. So in terms of that, I think that he can learn to do anything in terms of the coverage skills, and if he's exclusively at one position. But since he's been at Michigan, he's been all over. The first year they had him at cornerback, and he got hurt after the first couple games. The second year they had him at safety, but they started moving him around the field. And last year, obviously, he played 15 positions and 933 snaps at all these different spots. I mean, how do you end up knowing anything well? You saw in the first half of the year, when you watched last year, what he led the nation for the first, I think, 4 or 5 games in tackles for loss. He's 205 pounds. I mean, he was blitzing from a strong side linebacker spot, so he can do it. Obviously, teams adjust. They started overloading the line to protect against him coming in from wherever he was. They tried to move him around. But the idea that he can do all of those things and still be productive, I think that makes him a very attractive prospect. Just because he doesn't have a position, I mean, what does that say about NFL personnel? They should be creative enough to know what they could do with them.
Yep. Yeah, he's essentially a Swiss Army knife, as you described, Mark. It's funny because he actually reminds me, and I'm not saying that he's the same player, he reminds me of Shaq Thompson out of Washington a few years ago, who's now with the Carolina Panthers. And there were similar questions, Mark, if you recall, when Shaq Thompson came out. Yep. Is he a linebacker? Is he a safety? What do we do with him? And so forth. And for the most part, he's fit in very nicely with Carolina. You talked about the coverage skills for Peppers. And the one thing that jumped out to me is when you look at his stats, only 1 interception, if I'm correct, Mark. And I think there's been some questions about, even if you put him into a coverage position, does he have the hand skill set to thrive in that area? What have you seen in terms of his hand skills if at the NFL level he's got to maybe line up with receivers and tight ends?
Saw him catch punts for 2 years and he didn't drop one.
That's pretty good.
I think right there, shows all you need to know about his hands. I think that, the only interception he got was on a tip ball against Ohio State, but he was never in positions to get those. They didn't have him running with receivers downfield, and when he did, even when he was a safety, he's chasing guys. He's trying to run them down for the most part. He wasn't coverage because he was such a good tackler, especially last year. 2 years ago, not as much, but last year he made such strides in his tackling that you see what he can do. I mean, it's just, there's an interesting drill that he put. If you go on his Instagram from last summer, he did this drill. I think he said he saw it somewhere in the NFL. He put his hands basically inches away from a jugs machine, and someone fired the balls in, and he caught them in his hands right there, like 6 inches away, like maybe 10 balls in a row. You got to have crazy strong hands to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, no question about it. And this is the final question for me on Peppers, Mark. And I think I know the answer to it already, but I want to confirm it because to me, if you're a guy that your coach has confidence in you to move you around as much as they did, you have to have really good football instincts. You have to be able to react well and do all that stuff. Are those at an elite level for him, which I would imagine, like you said earlier, would probably make it easier for him when he starts to focus in on one spot to get good there relatively quickly?
Well, think of it this way, okay? This is the way Harbaugh described him. He said he's only had one other player who had the football intelligence of Jabril Peppers, and that was Andrew Luck.
That's
Andrew
not
Luck
bad.
only had to play one position. Okay, Peppers played offense, defense, special teams, and what he did is he would go from meeting to meeting, learn his spot, and move on, and then he played it in the game. And you never saw him, just exposed in any circumstance. So that shows how quickly. I mean, they were amazed, especially defense coordinator Don Brown, the special teams coach. I had coached him in high school, so he knew what was going on. And Harbaugh, they were just amazed at how they could throw things at him. And, that probably hurt him. That's hurting him now because they used him in so many spots. But it helped them in such a magnificent way because they knew that he could cover up for everyone. When he was hurt in the bowl game, Michigan had the number one defense in the country. And then you saw in the bowl game, Florida State was running all over them for the first, 3 quarters or so because they had to compensate because they knew Peppers wasn't there. He filled so many holes that was just obviously the dramatic difference, and they didn't know what to do. I mean, obviously they were putting a freshman in his place, but the idea that he filled so many spots and he could adjust not only between games but on the fly was remarkable.
Talking with Mark Snyder, who covers the University of Michigan football for the Detroit Free Press. Also on the defensive side, I think the 2 notable defensive ends are worth highlighting here, Mark. Taco Charlton and Chris Wormley. What is the major difference between both of them from what you've seen, and who may have a slight edge over the other based on what they bring to the table?
I think it just depends on what a team's looking for. I think Taco will probably go higher just because he's more of the traditional long, lean defensive end, someone like a Clowney type, who can really – he's not as thick, I guess. And what he can do, he's got the really long arms, and he's got that reach, and he's able to get around guys, swim moves. He's got a bunch of moves from the outside. Wormley's more of a power guy. He's 310, maybe 305, 310 pounds. He played tackle at times during his career, but he's fast enough at that size to get off the edge as well. So they're not the same player by any means, but they're both, they bring different things. I guess it depends on what they're looking for. Wormley is more of an anchor end at Michigan, and Charlton was more a guy who just could come off the edge. The thing about Charlton, Wormley was consistent. He consistently improved. The thing about Charlton, he just kind of exploded, in the second half of last year. For 3 years, he was just kind of there. I mean, he was solid. He was long, but he didn't use his physical gifts the same way. But you saw when he wanted to turn it on in the second half of last year, and he realized, this money time, he was as good a defensive end as anyone in the country. You saw that in the bowl game. In the final 3 games against Ohio State, which is obviously has elite offensive linemen who he was just burning those guys. And then Florida State in the bowl game, they didn't have a great offensive line, but you could see what he could do, against high-level talent.
Yeah, Mark, I want to follow up on Taco real quick. And, reading some of the stuff on him and the course of his career, the one word that's thrown out sometimes is inconsistent. But I wonder if some of that inconsistency is the fact that he was given a better opportunity his senior year, like you mentioned, to put up better numbers because the Michigan swapped over to a defense that probably fit his skill set better, and he got to play that more traditional 4-3 defensive end rather than playing that 3-4 end spot, which is, you don't really have as many opportunities to rush the passer from that spot.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very good point, and I think that playing in the 4-man line last year really helped him because they had dominant, and he's also playing with other NFL players. So I think that's true of all of these Michigan defensive linemen. When you look at them, you say they played with NFL players and they all produced still. So that shows the ability that they have to play with other elite guys. And I think with Taco, also, at the beginning of last year, he missed the first couple of games with an ankle injury. He said he suffered in the first game, and then he said he was plagued by it all year. I don't know how much he's, exaggerating that, but he said that, he wasn't completely healthy the whole year. So the numbers he produced late in the year when he wasn't completely healthy, still playing on that ankle, that shows a lot about, what he can do when he's motivated. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is the last one for me on Taco real quick. The thing I love about him is that he's 6'5", 277, Mark. You don't see these defensive ends coming out of college anymore. That, a lot of these pass rushers are, 6'3", 245, and, they're, a glorified 3-4 outside linebacker. This guy's got an NFL body, and do you think that in certain passing situations you might be able to move him inside to the 3 technique, given his strength and also his ability to stop the run?
I don't know about that. I don't know that that's really his move. I mean, maybe if he put on some more weight or something like that, but I haven't seen a lot of that from Taco at his time. Wormley, of course, can do all those things. I mean, he can come from the outside, he can go to the inside. He has the strength. He's one of the strongest guys that they've had but in recent years. But I don't know if Taco can. I don't know if he can do that. He's a specialist, probably more.
How is Taco on first and second down against the run, though? Just out of curiosity.
I think he's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's necessarily his forte.
Got it.
But I mean, if they, but I don't think. Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily his strength.
Well, one guy that I think it's safe to say, Mark, that can play inside is Ryan Glasgow as we move to the defensive tackle spot. And clearly he comes from good bloodlines because his brother's with the Detroit Lions. What has jumped out to you? Because, maybe when you look at him and you look at his numbers, they don't jump off the page. Perhaps his athleticism doesn't jump off the page, but he just seems like he'd be a good locker room guy and a good guy if you really want to preach toughness on your team. Is that a fair assessment of his play?
Yeah, I guess so. I think he's really strong, and Ryan is able, and he's such a good technician that what he's done, by holding the middle, no one got past him. I mean, he was able to clog up and take on a double team consistently, and that's what helped Taco. It's helped Wormley, it helped other guys around, and he was such a threat. You saw it with Michigan. Really, I guess you saw it the year before. I mean, Ryan had played, and he had a pec tear. I guess about 2/3 of the way through his junior season, and he had been playing really well and had emerged as one of the best defensive linemen, I guess, in the Big Ten, best tackles. And then he went down, and all of a sudden, Michigan's rush defense, which was #1 in the country, vanished. Indiana just put up a huge number on them. Ohio State put up a huge number on them, and Michigan was a different defense. And he was the only change that had made in that, and just removing him. So I think that sometimes with guys, you see the difference and you see their impact, especially defensive tackles, who you don't really get the big numbers out of. You see their impact when they're not there.
It's rare, Mark, that you see a team with 3 draft-worthy cornerbacks coming out in the same year, and then you could wonder how Michigan had the best defense in college football. Well, it's probably because of these defensive linemen and these cornerbacks that can cover. Can you parse through those 3 corners for me? What separates them? What makes them different?
Well, Jordan Lewis, obviously 2-time All-American. He's smaller, he's lighter, and no one beats him. I mean, except for the bowl game where there was a coverage mix-up, it seems like, and the safety really didn't help. No one beats Jordan. I mean, and 2 years ago, people were testing him, obviously, because they didn't know. I mean, he hadn't established himself, I guess, and he was small, so I think they attacked him, and he just continually. I mean, he set a Michigan record for pass breakups at 22 in season, and so they kept testing him, and he kept knocking them down, and no one could beat him. And then last year they didn't throw to him. He didn't play the first 4 games, I think, because of an injury. And then from that, the teams didn't test him. I think maybe 30 balls were thrown at him the whole year, something like that, just because they knew that he made plays on all of them. You saw his athleticism and his leaping ability at the end of the Wisconsin game. If you see that film, he made this one-handed interception where he was just absolutely laying out for it. And it was probably a play he didn't need to make. It was 4th down. But the idea that he can make a play like that and bring the ball in, shows his skills, because he really wasn't tested often enough to see, him. I mean, he also made this great interception the year before, I guess as a junior, when they threw to him against Northwestern, threw against him, and he made this play. If you pull up the film, he kind of ripped the ball out, and they caught it at the same time. He ripped it out and ran for a touchdown. It was just one of those plays where, he knew where to be and his technique was so impressive that he was right in the right spot to make a play on it. And so I think Jordan, he doesn't have the body that the other guys have or the size, and I think that's what hurt him. But his production was so elite, for 2 years. I mean, in the Thorpe finals for 2 years, that you could see, just by watching the film. Teams will see that. I think that's kind of the issue with him. In terms of Channing Stribling, Channing was thrown in there really early because of his size. And they got him. He was a 6'2" corner. And I think Brady Hoke's staff, which was before Harbaugh, was looking for big corners, and because they had a lot of little guys, and so they took the chance on him, and they threw him in there, and he got burned a couple of times by Allen Robinson in this famous game where Michigan lost in, I think, triple overtime at Penn State. And Robinson, I don't know if you've heard the story, but Robinson now has a tattoo of that play, one of those plays on his arm.
That's funny.
Standing in there. Which I guess it's funny unless you're Channing, but But I mean, and Channing just steadily improved, and he kept working at it. And last year he was tested obviously a lot because no one threw it against Lewis, and I think that he performed well throughout the year, and he showed the ability to play in coverage and as a big corner to be physical. And they, at Michigan, especially last year, they played man on man, and they were physical from the line all the way through. And I think that was something that he was able to show that. I think that, maybe Channing's numbers are – the numbers here in the combine and everything aren't so great, but I think that what you see is if you turn on the film, you can see him compete, and he's really physical, and he'll compete, and he's learned to use his size to his advantage. I think that wasn't working so much earlier. He would miss time jumps and stuff, but he really improved as the years went on. Jeremy Clark's an interesting one because he came in as a safety. He was not highly rated. Channing wasn't either, I guess. But when Clark came in, as a safety, they redshirted him, and he's just always big. He's 6'4", whatever. And then they needed help at corner, and they moved him to corner, and he was fast enough to play corner. So if you're 6'4" and you're 225, there's always this potential that you really could be a game-changing cornerback in the NFL because there aren't a lot of guys like that. And I think it's because guys that big obviously don't have the speed and the physicality to stay with people. But the thing is, Clark he played well the first couple of games last year when Lewis was out and he and Stribling were the two corners. But then he got hurt, and he missed the whole season with the ACL tear, the last, 8, 9, 10 games.
Yeah.
And so where is he physically? What can he do? Does he still have that speed? Those are the questions the team's going to have to answer.
Well, and I think that's also related to Jake Butt, the tight end. We'll get to that in a second. I don't want to jump the gun to offense because of his ACL tear. But staying on Lewis, my follow-up question to you, Mark, is the fact that even though he's small, and I think he's projected mainly to be a slot guy, he seems to be very effective in also stopping the run. What have you seen, and maybe overall for the corner group as a whole, but how good are they in terms of providing run support as opposed to what they do when they get down the field in coverage?
Yeah, they did a lot of that last year with under Don Brown, who's the new coach, the new defensive coordinator of Michigan last year. I think that he really emphasized bringing those guys up, and Lewis embraced it. I mean, Lewis is a great tackler. He was physical, even though he's so small. He was eager to do that. Stribling, not as much, and I think that that's something that he had to work on through the year, and I think that's something maybe he still would have to work on a little bit in terms of run support. But Lewis, yeah, even at his size, he was able to hit big and wrap guys up, but obviously it's going to be different if it's a 230-pound running back, or if he's trying to take down someone a little smaller than that. So that's where his size may come into play a little bit. I know he's projected as like a nickel corner or slot corner or whatever he's going to be, but I could see he played against bigger receivers and he was able to handle them. His technique was that good on the outside. We'll see if teams will embrace that, but he can do it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody wants Jordan Lewis, squaring up Leonard Fournette and trying to take him down the hole.
Right.
I don't think anybody's looking for that. How about the two say? I'm sorry, Mark. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No. I don't. But knowing Jordan, he wouldn't shy away from it. Some guys would be afraid.
He's got that tough
wouldn't
mentality.
Want to do that, but he would take it on.
Nice. All right. Well, let's go to safety, and you talked about Peppers already, but two other safeties coming out. I know DeMonte Thomas, is a guy that probably might go undrafted, maybe a really late round pick, but Delano Hill is going to be in the mix in the middle rounds, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. And Delano's really quiet, and that's kind of his. It's hard to get a read on him. I think he was very solid. He's not one of these verbal safeties, who's directing everyone everywhere. It's just not his personality, But in terms of technique, and he and Jordan played together in high school, Lewis, and I think Delano really took to the position and kind of and flourished last year, especially under Brown and kind of what they did. I mean, Michigan's had NFL experience in terms of these coaches in the secondary, and I think that's made a big difference. With Hill, he emerged and it was a steady climb, but he always had the talent and he can run. And I think that's really a big part of it. In terms of being physical, I don't know that he's a giant hitter, but he can do a lot of things back there, and I think there's some versatility with him.
It's funny. I would have thought he would have had more production as a coverage guy, given that he ran a 4.47 at the combine, which for a 6'1", 215-pound safety is excellent. But I guess they tended to use him closer to the line of scrimmage more than they used him as a single high deep guy going to sideline to sideline.
Yeah, I think they brought him up a lot, and that was just that was some of what he did. And with those corners, I mean, those guys were left alone all the time.
Wow.
That was
okay.
just kind of the way they did it. They let those guys go, and that's the nature of Michigan's offense. They said, this is the way we've got to operate. We'll see how that goes this year when they're playing sophomores. But with seniors and with senior and NFL guys, they said, you guys got to take care of your business, and then we can bring these safeties up, and that can make a big difference, and it helps in the run game for sure.
Yeah, the island mentality, a little bit tougher to digest when you're throwing out the underclassmen as opposed to when you have the veterans. I think that's a fair point. Talking with Mark Snyder, who covers the University of Michigan for the Detroit Free Press. I think we pretty much covered everybody on defense, Mark, so I think it's safe to transition to offense. And I go back to what I was teasing before, the tight end spot. And, this is a deep class at tight end. You could maybe wait to the mid-rounds and still get a quality starter. So, that's where you bring up a guy like Jake Butt, who's got the torn ACL, and you wonder, are teams going to question, can he return to his production value? The numbers are there. Maybe the blocking is a question mark. What's the biggest question mark, though, now entering the draft for him, given the blocking angle as well as the injury angle?
Well, he made a lot of progress with the blocking. Yes, he's not an elite blocker. That's just not who Jake is. He's a natural pass catcher. He was a basketball player in high school. He can get out and run and make the tough catches. He's not afraid to go into traffic. If you watch his film, he can go in traffic. When he gets the ball, he can move with it. I don't think he's not a guy who flies either. I don't think he has the physical gifts of O.J. Howard or something like that. But Jake had great hands. He rarely, if ever, dropped the ball, and he always knew kind of where he was going at all times. I think that was kind of the nature of Jake, is that he knew the plays, he was incredibly reliable, and he caught everything. In terms of the blocking, he understood that was a weakness, and I think that showed, because he came back for his senior year when he could have gone in last year's draft and maybe been drafted higher. Just because of the nature of that tight end class, and I think beyond Hunter Henry, there wasn't a lot going on there. And you saw he came back and he had a very productive season. He didn't match necessarily his pass catching numbers because they spread the ball around, but he never really had an issue with that. In terms of recovering from the ACL, I don't think that's a major issue either, because he's done it before. You look at he tore his ACL his sophomore year. Mm-hmm. He came back in, I think, 8 games, and he had all this production as a 2-time All-American in the years after that. So to think that he can't do it again, I think the reason you'd be worried, like I guess when we were talking before about Clark, if he's losing his speed, well, that's when an ACL you're concerned, because you don't know if he's the same player. Well, Jake never had that elite speed anyway. So, if he gets back to what he was, he's what he was. I think that the knee is not really an issue in terms of that.
Also, a couple wide receivers coming out from Michigan. Amar Darboh is someone that could even, sneak into day 2 if everything goes well. He ran a very solid 4.45 at the combine. What would an NFL team be getting if they decide to make him their selection on Friday night?
Yeah, I think that was kind of a surprising run by Amara as well, because we never saw him open up that speed really at Michigan. But he was always so solid, catching the ball and running precise routes. And he had great hands. There's a couple times you can look and see he made some one-handed catches that were just fabulous. And what he did, moving around, they were able to use him in different spots, but he was never the home run guy. So I think the fact that he can run a 4.4, will intrigue teams, because it can show them that maybe there's more there than they saw on film in Michigan. He had his role at Michigan. He filled his role. And Amaro was smart enough to basically understand, all the complex issues with the NFL offense that Harbaugh was running, and he really flourished under it, because he was so solid and steady that he became, for 2 years, I guess last year especially, but Wilton Spate used him a tremendous amount, because he knew that Darboh would always make the play, and Spate was a lot of times breaking tackles in the back and having to create on the fly, and Darboh was always available as an option. And I think that was kind of a unique part of it. He has decent size. He's strong, and he's steadily progressed. And I think that if you're an NFL team, you look at him and you say, well, he's had this steady progression every year, and that's kind of what they want to see, because that's a guy who continues to trend up and obviously knows how to learn.
In terms of the offensive line, I know there's 3 guard prospects that Michigan has, Mark. What is the difference maybe between the 3, and where do you see them projecting as to whether they could step in perhaps within the first 2 years of NFL experience and actually contribute?
Well, I think Eric Magnuson could be a tackle as well. Ben Braden, he may be more of a guard, even though he played tackle at Michigan somewhat. I think they all bounced around. Kalis only really played guard. He didn't really play tackle. That was only in high school. But Eric Magnuson, he played on the outside. I don't know if maybe his feet aren't quick enough to be on the outside, but he played in Michigan. He was pretty solid there, and I think he's the highest projected guy. Or he wasn't invited to the combine, but I think that he could be the highest guy just in terms of production, just because of his talent and what he did. He was very solid. You know, he rarely made major mistakes. Kalis was really up and down. He has that high-end potential. He has really that fierceness. You know, you want from a guard someone who's a mauler, and he has that. His dad played in the NFL. Todd Kalis for a long time. He played with the Broncos for a while. But I think that fire out of Kalis is really something that will appeal to teams. Technique-wise, you know, you would see some times when he would maul people, and then you'd see some times when he just, you know, he just let someone run right by him, and you never understood really why that was. So I think that's the thing with Kalis. There was a lot of inconsistency, but he has that high-end potential, you know, that really will be appealing teams. And, you know, sometimes these coaches say, well, I can be the one to fix him. Yeah. I can be the one to harness that if it's there. In terms of Ben Braden, you know, I was kind of surprised that he was the one invited to the Combine, but I think his athleticism really, and you saw it in the numbers at the Combine, his speed and athleticism really showed, you know, that he has the ability and the talent to do that kind of stuff. In terms of the technique and stuff, you maybe didn't see it quite as much, and they moved him around. Some of that's because they moved him guard, tackle, and stuff. I don't know if you see the same ferocity out of him as you see out of Kalis and Magnuson in spurts as well, but he definitely has the athleticism over the other two.
Did Michigan run mostly his own blocking scheme in terms of the running game, or was it mostly a power man-to-man type thing?
They went power, you know, recently, the last couple of years. I mean, they had done some zone earlier in those guys' careers, and all those guys were thrown in there. It's kind of an interesting situation in Michigan. Those guys were all thrown in really young under Brady Hoke, you know, they're as redshirt freshmen basically, and they got crushed, you know. I mean, there was one game. It was one game, 2013 or 14 against Michigan State, when Michigan ran for negative 48 yards because there were so many sacks and.
Wow!
And it was a record. It was a record in the history of Michigan football. And a lot of those guys were on the field, and there was no answers. It was just basically they had some young guys, they had talent, but they had to work their way up. And then by last year, you know, they were doing pretty well. I mean, they didn't have a 1,000-yard rusher in any of those years. Some of that's because of the rotation. I guess we'll talk about that with De'Veon Smith. But the idea, you know, that those guys improved over the years, that none of them ever became elite. Eric Magnuson was an all Big Ten, but I don't think anyone would consider any of those guys elite prospects. But they all improved as the years went on. And I think that, again, with an NFL team, you want to see progress. You don't want to see regression.
Well, you brought up De'Veon Smith, so, I mean, I'm curious where you see him plugging in because, you know, when you look at running backs, at least I'm looking at it through the Giants lens here, Mark. If you were to look at maybe what the Giants' need would be, it would be more of a power type of back. When you look at De'Veon, you're talking about a player that's 5'11", seems to be more of a shifty type of back. Is he seem to be a third down?
He's power. He's power.
You think that he could provide power on the next level? Okay.
Well, he's a power guy because he doesn't have the speed. He doesn't have the speed shifty. You don't see. I mean, his feet are okay, and he can get in and out, but he really doesn't. You don't see the takeoff speed in the NFL level. I don't think that he has that. I think that he's got to be someone. You know, he's a wonderful pass protector, and that's really what Michigan loved about him.
Oh, interesting.
You know, and Harbaugh especially, just because that's why he was the starter really for the last couple of years. He didn't have the breakaway speed. I mean, you saw a couple long runs, but really those were very rare. You saw a couple big games, but you know those were only occasionally. And he played through injuries. I mean, tough kid, obviously. You know, and he's very physical. But you've seen in both the pro day and in the combine, he did not have elite run. He didn't run in the combine, and then when he ran at the pro day, it wasn't that fast. So I think that's something he still needs to prove some of that speed. I think that's going to hurt him. But in terms of being able to pick up stuff, and as a pass protector, that's a really underrated trait. And I think those are the things that NFL teams are going to start to appreciate about Michigan's draft class this year and then going forward. Is that Tim Drevno, the offensive line coach, and Jim Harbaugh are stressing to them the things you need to succeed in the NFL, not necessarily those traits that just make you a great college player. And that's where De'Veon's going to help, because I think anyone who looks at their film sees what a massive role he played for Michigan protecting the quarterback.
Well, and I think you bring up a good point there, Mark, and that was going to be my last question to you about how the philosophy really has changed at Michigan, and maybe this is why we're looking at a group of almost 20 prospects this year that could wind up with NFL teams. You go back to Harbaugh's days with the Niners, Mark, he had a very good offensive line. He had Frank Gore, and I think those were staples of why San Francisco succeeded. Do you feel as if that's transitioned now to Michigan, where maybe how we view Michigan prospects is going to change over the next few seasons here?
Oh, I think so, yeah, and there's going to be more Michigan prospects in the draft. I mean, look through the Rich Rodriguez years and the Brady Hoke years, I guess that was 7 years. In the last couple, I guess, is the leftover of Hoke. There was only 2 or 3 guys a year. I mean, there were a couple good ones. Brandon Graham. You had, but he was recruited under Lloyd Carr, and then you had. I mean, you had a couple guys. You had Lewan, Michael Schofield, starter for the Broncos. And you've had moments, but for the most part, you haven't had sustained. And I think that across the board, they're getting the most out of these guys. Now, Brady Hoke's staff recruited all of these guys. So, he gets credit for that. But the development wasn't showing those first 2 years. None of them looked like NFL players those first 2 years. Peppers, he was even injured that year, but obviously everyone knew he was going to be an NFL player. But the rest of the guys, even the ones who were highly rated, you weren't sure. And I think that these last couple of years, the player development under Harbaugh has been dramatic. And I think that's why the team has improved. And I think now you're seeing that with the NFL draft.
A final question for me, and it goes to special teams. Kenny Allen, first of all, I think you guys might have a punter drafted this year. He catches my eye, 6'4", 222 pounds. You don't see many punters at 6'4", 222. So you can kind of give me a lowdown on him. Is he a power leg guy? Is he a directional kicking guy? And then on top of that, we haven't really touched on special teams much in terms of the guys we've talked about. Any of these guys that you think coming out could really be impact special teams players in the NFL? Because as you well know, that's where these guys are going to butter their bread their first couple years in the league.
Jabril definitely can.
Well,
I mean, look, he was fifth in the nation in punt returns last year, and some of the punt returns, if you can get a hold of this film, some of the punt returns that were called back because of holding calls or something like that were more impressive, than anything he actually produced. I mean, when you go and look at just write this down, the Rutgers film, you can find the play in the first half. He returned this punt where he ended up going under a tackler because the guy went high and he went under him and took it in. And it was magnificent, and it was called back, so it never got the payoff for it. But it was something you don't ever see.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
Return. And Jordan Lewis has those skills too. We saw a little bit of it when Peppers was taken off. The kick returns late in the year and the punt returns 2 years ago, and you saw some of the explosion. And I think Lewis has that ability, and especially if he's just playing, as a slot corner, you could see him get in the mix with some team and be able to do that and make an impact. In terms of Kenny Allen, it was kind of surprising that he didn't get invited to the Combine, I think for a number of reasons, but maybe the biggest one is that he can do everything. Last year, he was one of the rare guys, I think there were 4 or 5 guys in the country who did kickoff specialist, place kicking, and punting, and he did all of those last year, and which was really unique. I think that in his ability, I mean, I know people view him as a punter, and maybe his strength is that's what he can do, but he has the ability to do everything, and for a team to bring him in as a punter, but know he can do kickoffs, know he can do those other things, then they have the flexibility. I think someone's going to take a chance on him only for that reason, because they know that they can move him into a different spot when they get an injury or you have someone on your roster who's versatile like that. We actually just brought up the return here, Mark, and it was as advertised. That was pretty darn impressive. Final thing real quick before we say goodbye. Anybody on coverage teams really jump out to you in terms of, maybe being a gunner or helping out on kick and punt coverage that you think can really make an impact early in their NFL career? Out of these guys?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I could see Delano Hill being pretty aggressive. And Devontae Thomas definitely, has that ability. I could definitely see him doing some of that.
Great. Hey, Mark, we really appreciate the time. We know you kept you a while. Thank you so much. A lot of guys coming out from Michigan this year, I'm sure. This trend will continue over the next few years now as Jim Harbaugh's kids that he recruited start to kind of make their way through that Michigan pipeline, all right?
Thanks a lot, Mark. Appreciate
it. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey, great stuff. Mark Snyder, Detroit Free Press, covers Michigan football. Fantastic job. And now it's time for you to get involved on the phones at 201-939-4513. I think we should add Salomon down here doing this spot. We gave him the ecstasy of the Beanie Wells, Ohio State spot. I think we should have made him suffer through the Michigan spot.
True, to balance it out, in fairness. To see the joy that is brought to him and then the irritation that is brought towards him.
Or Sperling. We could have Sperling down here do it.
That's true. He's more of a Michigan guy, so he would have been joyous under the circumstances. We would have pleased 2 people within the department.
Yeah.
Based on our interviews.
And that's 2 more than we usually please.
That's true. There you go. Moving up in the world. There we go, the rankings.
201-939-4513. But really, it's a deep class, Lance. Maybe 2 or 3 players in the first couple rounds, but I think rounds 3 through 5, the same way it was when we did Miami last week, I think you're going to have a lot of players in the middle rounds coming out of Michigan.
Well, I think you can say the same thing about Ohio State, too,
yeah,
which
absolutely.
has a lot of depth as well. I would throw that school in the mix. But I would agree with you. I think that there's going to be some good finds in the mid-rounds where Michigan players are going to be selected. And I think they actually have some reasonable shots to perhaps be instantaneous contributors in year one. I mean, I brought up Ryan Glasgow. I've been very impressed with what I've heard and what I've seen out of him. And, I don't think he's going to be a first-rounder, but I think he's going to be a guy that whoever does take him, could get a nice, impactful player in the mix there.
Yeah, and he's not going to be a first rounder, not because he's not really good at what he does. It's just because that position that he plays doesn't profile. Generally, he's a first round pick. He's not a pass rusher. He's not going to get sacks.
Yeah.
But he is a poor man's Snacks Harrison, where he's going to come in, stuff the middle of that
first
line.
and second down.
And help the other guys in the line be more productive.
Yeah, and I think he'll be a good locker room presence too. So that's why we talk about
depth.
He
was a walk-on, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
that
saw
just
that
goes to show
you
how far some of these guys have come. And there's some players out of other schools too, where they were, written off and, on the middle of nowhere in terms of the rankings. And all
look
of
at
a sudden,
Garrett Bowles. He went to community college for 2 years.
Yeah.
Ramczyk. He was at Stevens Point, Division III. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, some of it is because of injury history, and the guys weren't necessarily ready to play at this level. But it truly is amazing when you look at some of the paths and the stories behind some of these prospects. But getting back to Michigan and looking at some of these players that I think had come in and day one make an immediate impact, there are certainly plenty of guys here, whether it be at the defensive tackle spot, the safety spot, I think is another one to watch out for, as well as the cornerback spot too. We just heard from Mark. I mean, 3 cornerbacks out of Michigan, and Jordan Lewis, I think, gets the majority of the notoriety, but the other 2 have some decent size, and you could do far worse if you're picking in the 3rd or the 4th round and you want to add some depth to your cornerback crew and you add some sizable commodities that Michigan has to showcase. Once again, that's where you build the depth chart in the draft, no matter what team you are. And this is the year that I think if you're going in and you're saying, maybe we don't need a bunch of starters, and I think the Giants fit this profile.
Sure.
They're going in, you look at the defense, and you're like, their starters are in good shape, but this is a year where, you could say to yourself, if we lose guys down the road in free agency or we lose somebody due to injury, you could really make huge strides in terms of your 5, 6, and 7 guys on the depth chart. And I think in a draft like this.
This is a draft where you restock the cupboard. And, you might be eating dinner and you have, you got DRC and Janoris Jenkins and Neil Apple at the dinner table where they're eating their food. But you're right. What happens when DRC's contract's up in a couple of years? Or, Janoris Jenkins, in 3 years, he's getting a little bit older.
Yeah.
Whatever. You want to have that 4th-round corner that you picked maybe this year that after 2 years of development is ready to step in and be a starter. And you're right. It's important in a draft like this where it's so deep on the defensive side of the ball to draft these guys that even if they're not going to help now, that might annoy some fans. Like, well, why the hell are they picking a cornerback in the 3rd round? He's not going to play. Why the heck are they picking a pass rusher in the 2nd round? He's the 4th, 3rd guy in our depth chart. Why are we wasting a pick on him? It's because in 2 or 3 years, you never know when you need a starter to step in.
Well, and that relates to, I remember when we did the Ohio State spot, a lot of the players who are now entering the draft, nobody heard of them when they were freshmen or sophomores because those kids were on the back end of the depth chart. And then what happens when Eli Apple leaves and some of these other notable commodities, they then get pushed into starting roles and they thrive. So if you're the Giants, I think you could look at it in a very similar way where, you don't necessarily need starters on the defensive line, or I should say defensive end specifically, and maybe perhaps at cornerback. But you know what? Things change. Free agency changes. Salary caps change. And you can always have players that can 2 or 3 years from now become your starters, and then you don't have to knock on the door of free agency. And think about how that changes your entire outlook as an organization.
Well, you mentioned stories, and I didn't have a chance to ask him about it. Before we get to your calls, we'll come in a second. Their wide receiver, Amara Darboh, he's one of those stories. His family fled Sierra Leone to avoid civil war there, lived in Des Moines, Iowa of all places when he was 7 years old, became a citizen in 2015, and basically at Michigan became a citizen in the United States. So there are stories just like that all over this draft of guys that, have come here and come a long way to kind of, have a chance to secure themselves for the rest of their lives if they get drafted in the right spot and put together a 5 to 7 year NFL career. you're going to make enough money where you're not set for life, but you're putting yourself in very good position to be successful.
Yeah, and that's why I asked Mark about just how the culture of the program has changed, because I think, what Harbaugh has done with some of the guys that he mentioned that Brady Hoke brought in, that just goes back to sometimes we look about how coaches, if they have great players, they can get by, but this is an example, I think, of what's going on in Michigan is the difference in coaching is the difference in terms of how far the players have moved from year one to maybe year 2 or year 3.
Do you know what it reminds me of? When you have these NFL coaches show up in college and you see the turnaround like that. Reminds me of when Pete Carroll went back to USC. He took all the stuff he did in the pros. He probably sold to his recruits that, look, I can turn you into good pros. You bring pro coaches. You teach pro systems. You teach them pro schemes in some cases. The Harbaugh's still using very much a collegiate scheme offensively in terms of using some spread and things like that. But if you teach these guys at the level you teach NFL players, they're going to be more prepared to come into the league. And they're going to be more effective in coverage and in college. And like Mark said, there's a reason these guys develop more under Harbaugh's coaching staff. It's because he's bringing in pro-level coaches. And that's how – and I'll tell you what, it worked with Pete Carroll and USC, and I would not be surprised for as long as Jim Harbaugh is at Michigan. And I think it'll be for probably at least 3 to 5 years before he decides to maybe give the pros another shot. This program is going to be in the mix every year.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be in a rush necessarily to leave, especially if you can make a name for yourself at your alma mater, by the way, where he played. But you did bring up a good point, and I think with Harbaugh, remember, he was at the collegiate level before he went to the NFL.
At Stanford,
so
obviously.
He's got experience both ways, and, you mentioned about him bringing NFL-caliber coaches. If I'm a freshman or I'm a sophomore, and my ultimate goal is to get to the NFL, I think I'd be probably in more of a position to want to listen to positional coaches who have been in the NFL and have done that, because if they're pushing me and they're telling me to do certain things, they're coming from a level where they know what it takes to be a consistent NFL player and actually hang around there, not just be a guy that flashes for 1 year.
I mean, yeah,
so that's part of the message.
And I'm not sure if this coach is even there, but just to give an example. If he brings in a guy and says, hey, freshman, idiot, this guy coached Justin Smith to become an all-pro. This guy coached Frank Gore to become a 10,000-yard running back in the in the NFL.